Word of God, and it isn't a dead word.
How do I know the Scriptures is to be believed? Because Jesus Christ has told me so.
This is the Westminster Podcast. My name is Nate Shannon. I'm here with Dr. Iain Duguid. Thanks, Iain, for being here.
Great to be here.
So, Iain, you've written many things, and you're obviously a specialist in the Old Testament. And I thought, I'm grateful that you accepted an invitation to come and talk about the Song of Songs. You have two commentaries on this book. Actually, maybe I'll ask you to tell us about why you wrote two. If you regretted the first one, or they gave you a second try. Both released about 10 years ago, 2015, I think. And so we're going to talk about this book. I'm excited to do that. You know, you've written on it, you've thought about it. I'm guessing you've preached through it, perhaps?
I have twice.
No, that's fantastic. And it just strikes me as interesting. Not a book that gets a lot of attention. I don't know if there are Reformed seminaries all over the world doing podcasts on the Song of Solomon, but I'm really looking forward because you're a redemptive, historical, Christ-centered interpreter and expositor of the text. So I'm just very excited and grateful. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Let me ask a couple questions. Actually, I'd like to read. Before we do that, Iain, if you could tell us a little bit about writing these two commentaries and how they differ.
Right. So the Tyndale commentary is a more academic commentary, and so it addresses the more technical questions in brief format, like the Tyndale commentary series is. And the Reformed expository commentary is really a series of sermons through the whole book. And so one sort of lays the foundation academically, and then the Reformed expository commentary models what Christ-centered sermons on these passages should look like.
Okay, so that's great. So you get to sort of stretch both your arms and your legs or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
Both sides of your brain. So would you say the Reformed expository commentary is that popular level, more or less?
Yes, yeah, it's very accessible. I've provided my own translation of the song, which I don't normally do when I preach. Normally I'm content to work from English versions, but because of the poetry in the Song of Songs is so complex, and there are a number of places where I wanted to differ from any one existing translation. So I provided my own translation there.
Okay, as a footnote, let me ask you, as an Old Testament scholar, about translating the text yourself. So I think that's exciting, and I enjoy, you know, when a guy says, "Oh, I worked through the text myself in the Greek or the Hebrew,"
Right.
and you know, having been trained at Westminster, I can appreciate that. At the someone else might wonder, wow, 2,000 years, or more since this text has been written, 3 ballpark. We're still trying to figure out exactly how to translate the Hebrew. Is there a sense in which, and this would go for commentaries as well, isn't Calvin's commentary enough or something? Help us appreciate the value of continually revisiting the Hebrew and even producing new translations.
Right. Well, poetry is particularly tricky. There are a lot of obscure words and phrases, and so there's more complexity there compared to, say, a narrative text. And of course, working your way through the text as a preacher is more complex in the Old Testament than the New Testament. Usually, people's Greek is better than their Hebrew, and then, in their sermon, they may be translating 5 or 6 Greek verses. If you're in Romans, whereas in the Old Testament, in narratives, you're typically translating a chapter, and so there, you really want to kind of focus in on the 10% of the text that will give you most bang for your buck. In many cases, you can look through even English translations and you see that they all agree about 90% of the verses.
Okay.
But then there's a few places where it differs. Now, in poetry, that's a bit trickier. On the one hand, in a song, the passages are shorter, so 10 to 14 verses, maybe less in some cases. But the complexity of poetry it makes it trickier. You won't know the vocabulary in the way that you'll know a lot of the vocabulary in a narrative.
And I think the average reader knows that, even in English.
Right.
There are words that will appear in the poetry that won't appear in a narrative.
Right.
And so if you're reaching for, well, let's be honest, if you're reaching for Google to find the meaning of a word,
right,
that will happen more often in poetry than in narrative.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, with that in mind, I hope you are a self-consistent being. And I'm going to just read a little bit of something you said, and then ask you to help us understand. So Song of Songs as poetry, and I think my guess is that the genre itself presents some difficulties, and that, now that I think of it, that may be the case for the layperson, but just as much for the seminary graduate who feels maybe over-equipped to interpret Paul, for example, and do some discourse analysis. But you can tell me off air if this is a forgivable way to say it or not, but there's a kind of looseness that I think is required in interpreting poetry, or maybe a little bit more freedom or something.
Yeah, well, the essence of poetry is imagery.
Yeah.
Leland Ryken argues that, even in terms of Hebrew poetry, where everybody talks about parallelism as the key feature, Ryken would argue that if all you had was parallelism, it'd be versified prose, not poetry. For Ryken, the essence of poetry is imagery, and certainly that's true in the songs, as it is in the Psalms. Right, the Psalms are all about poetry. Images of shepherd or rock, or you have oil pouring down Aaron's beard and onto his collar. These are very visual images, and the song is full of imagery. And imagery, of course, requires interpretation.
Right.
What is this imagery representing?
So you're referring to Phil or Leland?
That's Leland.
That's Leland.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Leland Ryken.
So
right.
Ryken Senior.
Right. So, yeah, that's very interesting. Imagery, but not mere symbolism.
Right.
Imagery in terms of sort of the I don't know if I can say it this way, aesthetic or the reader experience in terms of poetry is more than deciphering code language,
right,
or other than deciphering code language,
yeah,
as we'll see. Yeah. So you put it this way, and this is the P&R expository commentary. Part of the difficulty of the Song of Songs comes from the fact that it is a song, and therefore poetry. Poetry is the art of condensation, expressing maximum meaning in the minimum number of words. As a result, poetry is often more evocative than explicative. It doesn't take the time to unpack its figures of speech or to explain its analogies. It relies on the reader to fill in the blanks, or even just sets the reader loose, dealing with it in some ways, I think. Poetry tends to be open-ended, right? There's that kind of openness, leaving us pondering and wondering rather than trying to tie up every loose end with a watertight argument. Yet at the same time, poetry has a remarkable ability to address the whole person and to move our souls with a power that prose can rarely match. As I read this, Iain, I think we should do an entire episode just on poetry and just interpreting literature, because again, I think I'll allow you to say so, but again, we're not talking about decoding symbolism. There's much more going on. So you mentioned openness. You say the whole person is sort of addressed by the poetry, and there's an economy, a special economy, but it's not an economy for saving time. Right. That's not the point. Right?
It packs a punch.
Packs a punch.
Right. Now, it's intriguing to look at different translations in the way that they translate poetry. The ESV, for example, and this is Leland Ryken's influence, I think, is very committed to translating poetry as poetry. And so there's a lot of beauty in the ESV of the Psalms, but the cost of that is it's not as precise. So the CSB, I think, in the Psalms is less poetic. Certainly it's less poetic. People have critiqued it for that. But I think that's a deliberate choice in order to try to convey more clearly the meaning behind these images. And you can't really do both, right? You either have to choose, I'm going for aesthetic beauty, or I'm going for clarity here. Right. And those translations have gone in different directions, which means they each have their own value.
I mean, that's just that's just a weakness of translation itself, right? You can never
Yeah.
really relive it in another language.
Yeah. Every time I talk about translation, the thing I want to convey most of all is just how hard it is. We tend to assume that, oh, this is a good translation, this is a bad translation, without realizing the complexity of translation. That we think about tribal languages not having a word for, say, lamb or something like that. And so how do you deal with that? But in English, we don't have words for things that actually tribal languages may have words for.
Of course, yeah.
And so we're struggling to find the English word to fit. And then if we're also going to say, well, this has to sound like poetry as well,
right,
then we've added another layer of complexity to our translation.
Rhythm, cadence, those things just don't convey. Or like you're saying, you have to choose.
Right.
You can try to get one, but not
Right.
the others. Can you give us, thinking of the reader, and as always, I don't want this interview to substitute for reading the text. We
Right.
want it to be an on-ramp to the
Right.
text, an encouragement to the text. So thinking of poetry as a genre, how could you, maybe some do's and don'ts for the reader? Hopefully someone after this interview will say, I'm going to pick up Song of Psalms and read it again.
Right.
Can you offer some sort of guardrails for in terms of poetry as a genre?
Right. Well, yeah, the challenge is we're going to tend to want to be overly literal, or in certain places take as things as literal that are imagery. So, for example, in chapter 1 of the song, she describes her beloved as a king. Now, is that literal, or is that symbolic? Right? Is he a king to her? And many interpreters, certainly in Reformed tradition, would have taken that literally as a reference to Solomon. And you can see the certain logic to that, given that Solomon seems to be introduced in the superscription as a key player in this song. But then immediately after that, we have the representation of her lover as a shepherd, where she's going out in the middle of the day to try to find him with the sheep. Those two images can't both be literal, right? No king was ever literally out shepherding his sheep.
Right.
That's just not possible.
Contrary
Right.
personage. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, both of those images belong together, right? Kings are often portrayed as shepherds, but you sort of have to choose, is one of those literal? And if so, which one? Or is neither of them literal, right? That's another possibility, that both of these are representative images. But so the complexity of that is something, we're not used to in narrative, and even in the prophets, where generally much of what they say is much more straightforward.
Right. So what would you say to the reader who doesn't have an Old Testament scholar at his or her side and feels maybe frustrated? I don't know if I understand what the reference is here. And
Right.
what's the palm tree? And what's the pomegranate?
Right.
In other words, let me ask it this way: do I need to know what it represents in order to benefit from the text?
I think people are going to be kind of lost without good guidance. I mean, this is why we have preachers. Unfortunately, most preachers also feel a bit lost. But this is why preachers have commentaries, right? When we talk about sola scriptura, we don't mean solo scriptura. Right. We don't mean that. Well, and of course, there are Christians who do mean that.
Yeah.
Who want to read the Bible as if no one's ever read it before, and to dive into the text on their own, trusting in the Holy Spirit to guide them. And in the song, that's often going to lead people into allegory. In fact, in the Old Testament in general, reading the Bible on your own often leads people into allegory because they're committed to 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture is inspired by God and is profitable for teaching, reproof, training in righteousness. So this Old Testament passage must be profitable.
Yeah.
But I just cannot see how.
Right.
So how do I do that? Allegory.
Make it so.
Make it so. Yeah. Some connection, superficial connection to a biblical truth I know from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that's historically how a lot of people have treated the song. We free associate So we see king, and so we go run with king. Okay, God is my king, and so there's things that I can make connections I can make there. Shepherd, likewise. But then we run into real problems with palm trees and pomegranates, and there you get into wilder and wilder allegory. So, for example, there's a Reformed commentary. It's kind of more pastoral commentary on the song that talks about the Garden of Nuts in the song as a representation of the church.
Okay.
Like the walnut, hard on the outside, soft in the middle. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so once you've got church equals Garden of Nuts, I can think of other ways in which we could interpret that. I mean, I've been in churches that were certainly a Garden of Nuts, but there's no reason why one is better than the other.
So that once you approve one, you're just open season. You can do,
Right. Now, when I was taught the Song of Songs by Bruce Walke, when I was a student here 40 years ago now, I was taught there are three interpretive strategies, right? There's what you call the literal strategy, the typological strategy, and the allegorical strategy. And I started my work on songs on, assuming that was correct.
So when we're saying there are these three interpretive methods, this is a descriptive statement about sort of the dominant trends in literature.
Right.
It's not saying these are your three options.
Right. Yeah. Okay. These historically are how three different ways in which people have interpreted the text.
And actually, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about that. But also, your reading is not found among those three.
Right, I'm going to nuance that in a different way.
Okay.
Once I started to look at the different interpretive strategies out there, I realized there are two or four, depending on how you divide it. Right. So there are two fundamental strategies. One of which reads the song as wisdom literature, and therefore its primary referent is in terms of the human marriage relationship.
Okay.
And so it's giving guidance about love and marriage. Okay. In the way that wisdom literature guides us about, skillful living.
Yeah.
And then the other one is this, what we might call the spiritual interpretation, in which case the primary referent is in terms of our relationship with God.
Okay.
And you can trace both of those all the way back.
Really?
Right.
Okay.
So
to early interpretation, you mean?
Yeah. So the rabbis are complaining about people who are reading the Song of Songs as a secular song, which means that some people are doing it that way, right? And the rabbis think they're wrong, right? The rabbis want the spiritual interpretation.
Understandably, I suppose, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But what I realized is that within those two broad categories, each side has a subcategory.
Okay.
Or two subcategories. One of which is what we might call responsible exegesis, and the other which is wild free association.
Okay.
And so the allegorical category is not simply on the spiritual side. You can find the same thing on the literal interpretation.
Very interesting.
Tommy Nelson's Book of Romance, where the song is dating tips.
Wow.
It's every bit as wild in its free association as anything on the spiritual side.
Okay.
And then on the other side, you have what I've called responsible exegesis, where people on the literal side are taking it in terms of wisdom literature and interpreting it from what I would call a respectable perspective. And likewise, what was called the typological approach is really just the more biblical theological version of the spiritual interpretation.
Okay.
And so when they're looking for connections, they're looking for connections that the Bible itself supports.
Okay.
And so shepherd, so they're thinking about other biblical references to shepherds and making those connections rather than wild free association, where there's no biblical reason for this connection, but we've made that jump anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
which if you're allegorically interpreting the song, you have to do that, right? This is one of the challenges, I think, of the allegorical interpretation or the spiritual interpretation, is that it sort of has to insist that every nuance of the song has profound spiritual meaning. And so it's very hard, and I would argue maybe even impossible, to stick to a typological approach that's simply biblical theological without getting sucked into, repeatedly, making connections that you don't have biblical theological warrant for. So you end up with the watchmen of the city, right? They become ministers. And in the song, that in the woman's dream, they're beating her up. So what are the ministers of the gospel doing, beating up the woman who's the church? Got to be the church, right, in the allegorical or the spiritual interpretation. Well, those are unskillful ministers, who use the law. Okay. And we've all met them, right? I mean, this is this is the thing about allegorical interpretation, is that it's true often enough to have a plausibility to it.
It's sort of right. It's sort of for the sake of relatability,
right,
disregards hermeneutical integrity.
Right.
Or that's
right.
maybe an unfair way to put it.
No, it's not, because it's this desire for application that tends to make allegorists of us all.
And
we draw the wrong lines because we need a line of application, and we don't know how to get there. And so allegory provides us a means to make this applicable.
It almost becomes a kind of fine art of extravagant interpretation for the sake of application.
Right. Well, and the Puritans were masters of this. I mean, I love the Puritans for where they get it right, where they understand the text. They're so good at searching application.
So you talk about this book in particular, Song of Songs.
Yeah. But when the Puritans are out of their depth. Yeah. So like William Greenhill's commentary on Ezekiel, when he gets into the visionary temple in 40 through 48, he's got no clue what to do, right? Just as Gregory the Great before him had no clue what to do with the gates of the temple in Ezekiel 40. He's got an entire sermon on the gates of the temple. And the entrance to the gate becomes the ancestors of Jesus, and the gate has amplitude because of the mercy of Jesus and length. But, and you think, I mean, this is amazing, but has nothing to do with what the prophet
Fantastic
has in
human
mind.
ingenuity.
Right.
Unfortunately, nothing to do with the text. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
And the song has suffered greatly at the hands of Reformed interpreters who have exercised a lot of imagination in order to make the text connect.
Do you think part of that is just a discomfort with the content of the book?
Well, if you're Gregory the Great and your audience is monks, then your 80 sermons on the first 3 chapters can't...
You got to come up with something.
You got to come up with something. Yeah. And you got to come up with a lot if you're going to do 80 sermons on it.
Wow. Interesting.
But it's the same thing with a lot of Puritan interpretation. However, within that, if you search in that, there are also those biblical theological connections, because the Puritans are alert to those, right? And of course, the fundamental biblical theological connection is marriage as an image of the relationship of Christ and the church.
Right. So you're not at a great distance here there's a biblical theme within reach.
Right.
A prominent one.
Right.
Yeah.
And so these two interpretations at first sight seem very different, right? This is Christ's relationship with the church. Well, that also has to morph to God's relationship. There's an instability in there a little bit. But this is primarily, this is Christ's relationship with the church, or this is about human marriage. Those feel like they're very different. But if you look at the blurbs on the back of the book, people acknowledge that there's a connection. Right, so in Richard Brooks's commentary, which is all allegory, it's all about Christ and the church, the blurb on the back says, but that doesn't prevent us from learning from it about human marriage. Obviously, the person who wrote the blurb didn't read the book, because there's nothing in the book that makes that connection.
So it's almost like you can't avoid it. It's a tennis match. Every time you hit it, it's going to come back. Either it's about human intimacy
Right.
and romance,
Right.
or it's about Christ.
Right.
False
then,
dichotomy,
yeah.
it's got to be both.
Yeah, on the flip side, Tremper Longman's commentary, which is all about natural relationship, nothing about Christ. And yet his introduction, he talks about how marriage is the primary image for the relationship with Christ and the church, and therefore we can make those connections. He just doesn't do it in his Nikon, not at all. But it does make a difference which side you come from. What
do you mean by that?
Well, whether you come from the literal interpretation, you say, well, it's got implications for
Okay, your sort of starting point with the text,
right?
Yeah, okay.
Because if you start with this is primarily about human marriage, then you're not predetermined as to the roles of the man and the woman. So the man can make mistakes and sin, and as well as the woman.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Whereas if you start with the spiritual interpretation, you're locked into
a Christology.
The man. Everything man has to do is right. And so when the man's there knocking on the door in chapter 5 and then going away, well, he has to be right. And so this has to be about God's, leaving us for a season, and then you have a revival when he returns.
Yeah.
Whereas if you start with this is human wisdom about marital relationships, and there are times when she's not in the mood, and how does he respond? He may respond by withdrawing. The possibility, at least, is open for a wider range of interpretations of that action. It doesn't have to be a perfect action.
Well, and a wider range, more faithful to the text.
Right.
In other words, you're able to deal with the text at face value.
And then the connection to be Christ can be in terms of contrast. So humanly, your husband may sin against you and let you down in the situation, but Christ, he relates to us perfectly.
Yeah. Let me try one more time to get you to say something about if I'm at home alone reading songs and I don't have a commentary. This is sort of a genre question as well. I mean, is there value? Let me ask it this way: is there value in reading poetry and sort of experiencing the poetry as literature without all the information that I may want or desire as an interpreter?
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just sort of the artistic. If I sit in a concert hall and I listen to a Beethoven Late Quartet, I'm not the kind of guy who's going to tell you, oh, he just modulated from F minor to... I'm not able to,
But it sounds beautiful
but I'm still able to benefit from it. So is there something parallel here for the average...
Absolutely, Okay. If you get the fundamental connection between a man and woman and the relationship of Christ and the church, and you're looking for those biblical theological connections, they're certainly there to be recognized. And the celebration of love at the end of the song, that love is as strong as death.
I mean, all the affectionate language. Some of the images are unforgettably strange for us contemporarily. My neck is an ivory tower. Your neck's an ivory. That's not something I would say. But supposedly in the context, maybe it would have worked. You can help us with that. But obviously I knew that's what you're going to say, and I'm so pleased because it's poetry. Right. And the Lord used poetry because he likes poetry.
Right.
And there's something special, and I love what you say that poetry has remarkable ability to address the whole person.
Right.
And if we're reading Paul, there's some sense in which the mind is the starting point.
Right.
Of course, the whole body, the whole person is involved, is addressed by the apostle. But first you're trying to figure out, how do I reorganize this sentence so it makes sense to me? But if you're reading Song of Songs, you're thinking about the juice of a pomegranate. You think about the smell, the aroma, perfume, and the, I don't know, a gazelle and the grace and whatever it is, the physique and their colors. His body is this color and these things.
But just as there's some music that will really come alive once you listen to somebody explain what's going on.
For sure.
Then I think the song is going to, we're going to need, compared to the Psalms, which are much more accessible poetry. But the song, I think we probably need a bit more guidance.
For sure. I would say because this is written, we still listen to Beethoven Late Quartets. Because they still endure, etc. We still read. And I think that's what's so lovely about the genre. That you can, about all of Scripture. You can read it with your kids.
Right.
But Iain Duguid,
Right.
who's translated himself, can still read it
Right.
devotionally and benefit from it.
Right.
So, like at all levels, the
Right.
Lord ministers to his people through the
Right.
word. Yeah.
Well, let me make another point about the song here, because I think people are sometimes intimidated about reading the song because they're afraid that, it's going to be embarrassing. That it's, it's full of this sexual imagery.
Yeah.
And, I when I first was going to preach it, I thought, well, do we have to have an extended children's church? Because is this going to just be too embarrassing to read in front of, for the kids or
yeah.
for the sermons?
Yeah.
But the song is remarkably opaque in some respects, right?
It's very discerning in that sense. Yeah.
It's it's not like Ezekiel 16, which you can scarcely read in public, and even in the toned down version of English translations, that really is deliberately offensive. Whereas the song is beautiful in the way that it presents love and sexuality through these images that are not offensive and gross, but are beautiful and attractive.
I think that just what you've just said sort of captures the effectiveness of poetry. So, for example, I correct me if I'm wrong, I think I could read passages of this to my young kids.
Right.
In a sense, and that, hey, Dad, what does that mean? I said,
Right.
well, they love each other.
Right.
And they're trying to they're using all these rich images of God's
Right.
world
Right.
to try to capture something that can't be captured in technical language.
Right. And from our earliest days, we want to be communicating to our kids what marriage is, what marriage should look like, because the world certainly is.
That's right.
Right. Even the kids' programs they're watching, and the
sure.
kids' books they're reading. Right.
sure.
What do they tell us about the marriges in these relationships? Right.
The man's always a goof.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Narnia stories, you've got you've got Mr. Beaver and Mrs. Beaver, and they're fitted into certain roles.
Yeah.
And so our kids are constantly being bombarded by images of marriage.
Yeah.
And we want to be communicating with them one of the key elements of this vision, which is that love is at the heart of marriage. And that marriage ought to be more than just a convenient relationship in which people who basically get along
Transactional
decide
partnership or
this
something.
is an efficient way to raise children.
Yeah.
That whole love dimension, which the world will hijack and take in its own directions.
Yeah.
And yet, the song gives us words to address our children from an earlier stage, but also as they get older, to talk to them about sexuality, which, of course, the church historically has done a lousy job of, right? We just don't talk about it.
I think that's right.
And as a result, we leave that education to other people.
So that's very important. You're saying is, of course, discernment is required.
Right.
My kids are not ready for everything.
Right.
But you can't take your eyes off the road. In other words, negligence is not a winning strategy either.
Right.
At least for the reason that you've pointed out, that they are being taught.
Right.
Inevitably. You
Right.
can't plug your ears and close your eyes.
Right.
And another thing you said I think is very interesting. I think during the course of my adult life, within recent memory, sort of cultural, let's say secular conception of marriage has moved from just sheer romance, just marry the person you're crazy about.
Right.
It's like it's the end of dating. You
Right.
date, you're crazy about it, man, go for it, love. But I think now the predominant sort of template is the one you mentioned, transactional and functional.
Right. Which the song is all about.
Okay.
Because that's Solomon's view of marriage. Look at 1 Kings 10. Why does he marry all of these women? It's not that he's a sex addict, although, that is not wildly out of the picture. These are all transactional relationships in which there's something that he's getting politically out of this and economically, right? It's the economy, stupid. So why does he marry Pharaoh's daughter?
Yeah.
Well, because politically,
It's not because she's great at chess and so
right,
am I or something.
right.
Yeah.
Politically and economically, it's good for him, And the song is saying, yeah, but that's not what marriage is. Marriage is about passion. And that's what that's the piece. If we miss that in terms of human marriage, then we miss it in terms of our relationship with Christ. And I think a lot of Christians kind of view their relationship with Christ as functional. I need a savior. He's willing to be a savior. He's willing to put up with me, and so I get
Works
heaven.
out great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Works out great. Yeah.
But if you miss passion, then why the cross? I mean, who would go to the cross for a functional relationship?
Yeah.
And
People don't. Thus the divorce rate, brother.
Well,
Yeah,
right,
that's
exactly.
Right. Yeah.
But Christ's love for us. I mean, the fact that God has built this into the design of marriage, and it's there with Adam and Eve. It's rarely there in the Old Testament. I mean, there are very few Old Testament relationships where you can talk about them being all about love, right?
Right.
Few exceptions, but not many. But God's relationship with Israel throughout the Old Testament is passionate. He's a jealous God, right? Why would he be a jealous God, right? If it's just transactional, hey, I don't care. You go your way and I'll smash you, but I don't care. Even in the Old Testament, the tragedy of the Old Testament is that God has loved his people and has done everything for them and has invested himself in them, and they have still gone the other way and loved their idols. And it breaks the heart of God. I mean, this is language that in systematic theology we have to wrap with all kinds of provisos, and because we've got to get our lines crossed.
I've been there. Gratefully,
Yeah.
that's not our problem today. So,
But the Bible, alongside that correct theology that's really important, we've got to get right,
yeah.
portrays God in these human images
Yeah.
as this husband who has loved his wife and she has trashed their relationship,
Yeah.
and he is, his heart is broken.
Yeah.
And the song gives us this beautiful picture of what that relationship is supposed to be, and thus points us to Christ as our ultimate husband, and to the fulfillment of that relationship in the New Jerusalem, this beautiful bride coming down from heaven to be united with a husband who is not like Solomon, who is the opposite of Solomon, in that he is invested in his bride in this passionate way, not for what she can do for him. It's not, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask not what the church can do for Christ. It's what he has done for her.
Oh, that's so good. So that brings me to this statement from your book about your approach. It's very interesting that you see Solomon as a foil in the text. So I believe it was possible to steer a middle ground between the allegorical and literal extremes, as you've been explaining, to recognize the Song of Songs as wisdom literature that celebrates a great mystery in life, which I think is great. And in that sense, poetry almost has to be the genre, right? Which is the great mystery in life, the mutual love of a man and a woman. Yet that in this celebration will not only shape our thinking about human relationships, but also show us profound insights into the love that Christ has for his bride, the church. It's somewhere in this page. I've lost it for the moment. But so can you tell us then about, as sort of a way into your interpretation of the book as a whole, the role of Solomon? So as you mentioned, there's the chapter 1, verse 1. In the ESV, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. And so the instinct is that, Paul, an apostle. Okay,
Right.
so this is from Solomon.
Right.
I get it. But your take on his role in the book is a little bit different.
Right. Yeah, and it starts right there in that superscription, which people tend to assume is a ascription of authorship, right? Because we're used to superscriptions in the Psalms often ascribing authorship. What's striking is the difference between this superscription and the superscriptions in the Psalms. Because we have superscriptions in the Psalms. For example, one of the Psalms of Ascent, Shir HaMa'alot, a Psalm of Ascent, Lishlomo by Solomon. But here it's not the Song of Songs, Lishlomo. It's Song of Songs, Asher Lishlomo. Now, where do we find Asher Lishlomo? We find it in 1 Kings 10. That same chapter where it's talking about what belongs to Solomon. the horses that he's bringing from Egypt, and so on. And so this is about what belongs to Solomon, and by implication, what doesn't belong to Solomon. Now, having said that, there is a three-person view that has been quite popular that is not my view.
Okay.
And you'll find this view in Ian Provan's commentary in the Nivak series, for example, whereby you have a love triangle in which you have Solomon, and you have the woman, and you have her shepherd boy lover. And she somehow got tangled up with Solomon into his harem, sort of against her will. She's been swept up in that somehow, which is not impossible as you think of Esther. You know, it's a similar kind of relationship.
Right.
But she really loves her shepherd boyfriend, and that's her real love.
Wow.
And
who has the telenova rights to that?
Well, right, yeah.
Spectacular.
So there's this whole backstory that then is kind of fitted into the song. Now, as a pastor, when I hear this, I can't help but thinking counseling overload. And, here's this line of women showing up on Monday morning saying, so what I hear you say is that this woman is married in a marriage relationship that she was sort of pushed into, but doesn't really love the guy.
Oh, boy.
And now she's rediscovered her Facebook boyfriend from high school.
Right.
And what I hear you saying is that that's her real love and she needs to go for it.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, no, that's not what the Bible teaches. So in my view, you still have the three characters, but she's not. There's nothing in the story that tells us that she's part of Solomon's harem. She's not married to Solomon. It's she and her humble boyfriend, who's just a shepherd, just an ordinary punter, have a relationship that is so different from Solomon's. Right? It's a one man, one woman, till death do us part, for which Solomon couldn't possibly be your model. Right? He's the opposite of that. He's not even that model in his first relationship. Right? His first wife is Pharaoh's daughter, and people don't think about the implications of that. But he is the model of transactional marriage. Yeah. If you think about him historically, and even if he were to have written this in his youth, as the Jewish rabbis suggested, before he gets caught in all this other stuff, would you seriously use him as a poster child for a one-man, one-woman relationship after everything that happens?
The way his career turned out,
Yeah, I mean, if you had somebody who came to your church and did a seminar on marriage, it was brilliant, and you loved it, and you put it on your church website, and then he later goes on and has multiple serial relationships with other women, are you then going to leave that up? Even if everything he said is true, his character totally undercuts everything he said. So I think Solomon is the foil here, but without that, without that whole backstory. And you see it in chapter 8, right? Solomon has this vineyard that's worth 1,000 shekels, and he has managers, he has keepers to take care of it. And it's in a place called Baal Hamon, the husband of the crowd. Which we don't know of any place like that, but the name is suggestive that it's a description of Solomon's relationship with all these vineyards, right? Wow. But she has her own vineyard, which she gives to her beloved. It's it's not 1,000 shekel vineyard; it's just an ordinary vineyard. But she has control over who she gives it to. She gives it to the one she loves, and that is the essence of what we've been talking about, right? That's why it shows up in chapter 8 as you come to the climax.
Wow. That's so you see narrative movement throughout the text. Is that right? You see sort of before you see a kind of a courtship, a kind of dreaming, then you see a consummation, and then you see afterward.
Right. Yeah.
Is there a sense? So when I read, I'm going to ask you about some textual details.
Right.
A couple passages that struck me. Is there a sense in which the love that we see, the affection that we see, is youthful?
Oh yeah, it's a springtime setting, right? Throughout the whole poem takes place in the spring. Okay. And particularly in chapter 2, you see that and you feel that. But yeah, these are young people. Yeah. I mean, C.S. Lewis talks about the fact that how could you possibly maintain that youthful ardor?
So that was my next question in terms of
it wear you out, right? Yeah. But there's something about looking back to that.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So as older people, you look back on that, and there are things you love about that, and the things you say, okay, I wouldn't go back.
That had its moment, and the moment has passed.
Yeah. But there's something about the beauty and excitement of youthful attraction that is bound up with what marriage is. And so as an old cynical married guy, it rebukes me and says you should go back to that, right? Even old people can go away for a weekend and
rekindle
focus on
the
each
love
other.
of your youth.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, Jesus rebukes the church for having
Exactly.
forgotten their first love.
Exactly.
That's very interesting.
And so if he does that in his marriage to the church, then how much more do we need to work at that?
So there are multiple characters. We have the woman. We have her beloved, or the two beloveds. We have Solomon as a foil. We also have this chorus of others.
Right.
Tell me about that. The identity's not. Well, at one point it seems as though they're all female. Is that right?
Yeah.
And they, at some moments, they cheer them on. There's also a little bit of a debate, isn't there? At one point where there's some tension, if I remember, between the woman and the chorus. Can you tell us sort of what function that anonymous crowd plays in the story?
Yeah, so I think this is part of your target audience for your wisdom literature, right? I mean, who is it who you need to teach about marriage? Well, obviously it's married people, but primarily it's people who are preparing for marriage,
contemplating marriage. Yeah.
So the daughters of Jerusalem form a group that can represent the voices of the audience and be addressed, right? So you have that refrain, do not stir up love before it, which is hard to allegorize, right? Because if the woman is the church, why would you be telling her not to stir up love before it's ready?
How about that? Yeah.
You got to go through some pretty big gymnastics to work through that.
Yeah.
Whereas as wisdom literature, well, duh, right? I mean, what do young people need to be told? That particularly in a context like that, young women are very eager for marriage, right? Because it's my ticket out of house where my parents don't understand me, and that's the beginning of my real life, particularly in antiquity. And this slow down, right? I mean, and again, we got to think about how does that play out in our culture, where the advice we give to young people is not necessarily slow down, right? The advice in our culture to young people often is you need to think about getting married before you've reached 35, right? Before you've accomplished all of your career goals. Because what have you said in setting your career goals ahead of marriage and family? Well, that's my priority. That's where I get my real value.
Right.
Whereas one of the things that the song shows us is this value of marriage. And interestingly, not simply in terms of childbearing. So in antiquity, people would have thought of marriage often in terms of, well, that's how you get babies and acquire significance. Yeah. But the song doesn't focus on that. There are psalms that do, right? It's not like the Bible doesn't focus on that at all, that, children are important, but that's not the message of the songs. The message of the song is that marriage is important. Marriage matters. Committing yourself to another person in this one man, one woman until death do us part. Because it's the primary image of the relationship of Christ and the church, a devaluation of marriage is wrong. And so, and in some ancient cultures, you probably wouldn't have had to bang that gong because everybody would have agreed with you, right?
Right.
But in our culture, marriage is so devalued.
Right.
Why? Well, firstly, because we've lost the connection between marriage and sex.
Right.
And so passion can be fulfilled without marriage. And the song says, no, that's not how it works. You can't really have the passion properly without marriage because you don't have the safeguards, you don't have protection. You're going to get hurt. And I've argued in my commentary that chapter 2 is a warning against pursuing that too soon, right? this refrain, "Do not stir up love before it is ready," because twice in the song, so it's clearly important as a part of the wisdom message of this psalm. So yeah, the connection of the legal and the affectionate and the relational all together in marriage, which I think the song portrays, is going to challenge cultural views of marriage in every day and age, just differently, because there are different ways we get it wrong. But it's always going to address the culture and challenge it, as wisdom literature does. It's always going to challenge it and say, and force us to ask the question: how does my culture misunderstand marriage? And yeah, in our culture, people don't value it. Whereas in the song, marriage, I argue, is right at the center. Right, it's before the consummation of the relationship. And then, the second half of the song, you also see them dealing with problems in marriage, and wrestling with that, and that's not a surprise. That's not a bug.
Right.
That's a feature. That's part of what it means to be married. And so there's profound truth here. The first time I preached it at Grove City College to a congregation largely made up of college students, which is a brilliant context in which to preach the song, because they're right. There are your daughters of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
They're wrestling with the issues of what's involved in marriage, and how do I think about marriage, and is it appropriate? Do I have to wait until I got my career sorted out? My wife and I talked to some parents who were blocking their kids from getting married, even though they were Christians, loved the Lord, about to graduate from their undergrad. And they said, no, you can't get married until both of you have completed your master's degrees. And we're thinking, why are you thinking that, right? Well, because they're so shaped by the culture, which says that career is what really matters, and then we'll fit marriage and family in around that.
I would think that once those things are aligned, once they're looking at each other in the eye like that, you got to lock it in before it's that's the time.
Well, and you know what happens if you
that's what I'm
push
saying.
it off.
That's
right?
what I'm saying. There's all kinds of
that's how you end up
avoidable complications.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that message about marriage, is a profoundly needed one in our culture. And that's why the song is so important for the church, because it's the primary place where we get to talk about love and marriage. There are other places incidentally in Scripture where the topic comes up. But here you have my view,
you can't look away. I mean,
and if you take it allegorically or spiritually, then you can easily avoid talking about its practical implications.
Right.
It's all about Jesus.
Right.
And of course, my sermons are also going to be all about Jesus. You're never going to miss Jesus in one of my sermons. I give you a guarantee right here. But you miss all of that practical teaching for young people and older people about love and marriage, which is something that is central to our lives. And if it's not, that's equally a problem.
And in that sense, Iain, I think you get a better gospel, because you get a gospel of the one who was also
right.
Christ is the firstborn of the new creation. He was also
right.
the firstborn of the first creation.
Right.
So in that sense, you get a gospel which it's because he so loved the world.
Right.
And he repeats that he takes great pleasure in the things that he had made.
Right.
And so I think, although there may be some interpretive challenges to reading 8 chapters about human male-female intimacy and bringing that together with the Gospel of Paul or something, let me state that again, with the Gospel of Jesus Christ. I think they go naturally together. And I think,
right.
again, I think you get a richer gospel because you get a Christ who's not unable to sympathize with
right.
us, and a Christ who wants to remake creation, not just put us in spiritual escape
right.
pods and shoot us out
right.
into the darkness.
Yeah. Well, and here's how it works. Wisdom literature is indirect law. right? It says, do this and you shall have a good relationship, in this case, right? Do this and you shall live. And so the song convicts all of us as failed lovers. You know, whether we're married, unmarried, longing to be married, not longing to be married, it convicts us of hard attitudes that are wrong and actions, in many cases, that are wrong. You know, in that audience of Grove City students, I am sure that I was addressing people who were sleeping with people they shouldn't be sleeping with, who are fantasizing about that, people who were wrestling with same-sex attraction issues. This song convicts us of our sins, and then it points us to Christ, the one who has perfectly kept the law, who has loved his bride, even though she didn't deserve it, in ways that we have totally not. And so the righteousness of Christ becomes beautiful to us as our only hope in life and in death. And then his death on the cross for our sins, and the glory of, because whenever you're talking about Christ and the bride, it's going to take you eschatologically to this beautiful picture in at the end of the book of Revelation. So you got the doxology, which is which is so fitting for the song.
This isn't. I'm very happy to recommend to the reader, the expository commentary, because it's very conversational,
right?
And it as you've just done for us today, it weaves so nicely together a discussion of the text itself and that gospel direction and bringing Christ to us in the specific and maybe peculiar but exciting way that this book does.
Right.
So I'm happy to recommend your Reformed expository commentary on Song of Psalms to the listener. Just to conclude, Ian, tell us about, you shared before we hit the record button about a text you're working on or that's coming out soon.
Right.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so it's a Psalms family devotional called The Lord Saves Me, which is coming out in April. I have grandchildren, so I'm always on the lookout for good resources for them. And so many of the resources, good resources for our kids, deal with Old Testament narrative. And so Old Testament stories, some of them moralistically, some of them more helpfully, but they don't train our children how to read the Psalms or how to address the prophets, for that matter. And so I thought it'd be fun to have a Psalms devotional where I've done my own translation of 40 of the Psalms, a kid-friendly translation, obviously more dynamically equivalent, less literal, but hopefully capturing the force of those Psalms, and then put that together with a short devotional, also kid-friendly devotional, and a short prayer. So they're very easy to use, even if you're not regularly in family devotions. You can pick this up and you can read it with your kids, to your kids. Depending on the age of your kids, get into some discussion with older kids about the topics here, and hopefully develop in them a growing love for the Psalms and for the poetry of the Bible.
Fantastic. Thanks for your time today, Ian.
Thanks. It's been a great pleasure to be with you.
This is the Westminster Podcast.
This has been a podcast of Westminster Media. Westminster Media is a ministry of Westminster Theological Seminary. If you would like to join us in our mission to train specialists in the Bible, to proclaim the whole counsel of God for Christ and His global church, please visit www.wts.edu/donate. This podcast was hosted by Nate Shannon and edited by Brandon McLean Smith.